Okay, so we start out with an apology. I have been saying something wrong for many years, and I think that I've said it wrong even here. I've been saying that the existence of the Hittites revealed in the discoveries of 1906, 1908 is when they did some archaeological findings on them, shows that higher critical scholars who denied their existence previously were wrong about their disbelief in the Bible. Well, that's inaccurate. And as I was digging into where this all comes from, where does it come from? There's an introduction to the Old Testament by R.K. Harrison, wherein he says, cuneiform texts from Bogazkoy have demonstrated conclusively the cultural virility of the Hittites. He's saying our archaeological finds have shown that they're real, who were once relegated by liberal critics to an insignificant place in ancient Near Eastern history. So they were relegated to insignificance in part because they're not nearly as impressive as the Babylonians or as the Egyptians, whom we have more record from. But they didn't deny their existence. And the only liberal critic that he cited was Heinrich Ewald, who in 1883 wrote that the biblical Hittites who inhabited Canaan must have been different from the more northern Hatti mentioned in Assyrian inscriptions. This isn't a denial of their existence. This is a confusion that we'll be getting into today, is what is the relationship between the Hittites of the Bible, of the land of Canaan, and the Hittites of eastern and northern Anatolia, or Turkey. So this ad hominem argument against higher critical scholars doesn't hold up. So hopefully you haven't been making the same mistake as I have, but we have to lay that aside. Okay, so let's get into some of the biblical references. Let's start with the biblical references of the Hittites, sons of Benai Hetim. So it starts pretty early. Genesis 15, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. And this is repeated many times. This sometimes it's 5 people groups, but the Hittites are usually in there, and they're usually in there kind of alongside of the Canaanites. And so it seems that they have a similar geography. We're assuming they're in a similar area. And of course, Abram interacts with them. But this is a different geographical spread than what we usually think of with regard to historical Hittites. What we know from their cuneiform tablets about how far they advanced in the Bronze Age before they fell. Here's Genesis 23, to not only let you know that the people were there, but they owned property as well. Sarah died at Kirjath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, who must have been standing nearby, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. So he's the sojourner and foreigner, not them. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. Again, one of the things that you've heard at this from this pulpit is the importance of burial in the ground. It's so important that this is the first piece of property that Abraham's interested in buying. That's how important this is. Hittites answered Abraham, hear us, my Lord, you are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. So here, from reading Genesis, we've just assumed this. This is where they are. It's not a question mark for us, but we'll see some of the difficulty later. But land of the Hittites and kings of the Hittites refer to certain Syrian kings who once belonged to the Hittite Empire in Asia Minor. This is according to the book, The People Around the Old Testament. All Hittites named in the Bible have good Semitic names, which make their affiliation with Canaan more intelligible. This is from the World Biblical Commentary. So you'll have Ephron the Hittite, Uriah the Hittite. Can't remember what Uriah means, but the Yah ending is referring to Yahweh. So Semitic and even Israelite. That's much later, of course, right? After they've come in and conquered the land. But here also we have it, Esau. He took Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. It matters pretty little what genealogy their names are coming from, or what, whether it's Semitic or Hittite. We'll see some Hittite names later, and you'll see some of the difference. But they seem to look like Semitic Hittites. Exodus 34, observe what I command you this day. Behold, I'll drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, Perizzites, and Hivites. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go. Tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their Asherim. Now here we get a little insight into, we got a lot of different people groups here, but this might be an insight into their mythology. Do all these different people groups have this same pillars and Asherim? I think we'll see some support for that later. But so that's one of the only references we get to the Hittite in particular, his mythology. Numbers 13. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea along the Jordan. Okay? So they're in the hill country. We remember the Jebusites, right? Because Jebus was Jerusalem previously. So that's the type of hill country that we're thinking of. Not the Shephelah, not the nice, the plain. This is the hill country, the shepherding country. This is where the author of Numbers is saying they live. Deuteronomy, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, named first, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, 7 nations, get this, more numerous and mightier than yourselves. So this is referring to a large population, and there's some difficulty with the numbers of Israelites coming in terms of how do we reckon them, but they're large. And so then these guys are even larger. So this is going to play into my understanding of things, that this is a kind of a named people group that spreads all the way up into Syria and Anatolia. And whether or not these people are all related to one another doesn't matter very much. That it's just more that they want to be known as Hittites. Joshua 1:4, from the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. So this is a wide spread, all the way to Euphrates. We don't usually think about that as the land of Israel, right? But that's encompassing Syria. To the Great Sea, that's the Mediterranean Sea, all the land of the Hittites. So it kind of has Syria in its purview there. So usually when we think of Israel, we're thinking just this mountain region just beside the Jordan and down to the sea. Well, no, according to this, it's much broader than that. And so that's why it's appropriate for us to think about the Hittites because the Neo-Hittites were in Syria and encompassed a large people group there. Joshua 12, 7 through 8. All these kings of the land, whom Joshua and the people of Israel defeated on the west side of the Jordan, from Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon to Mount Halak that rises towards Seir. And Joshua gave their land to the tribes of Israel as a possession according to their allotments, in the hill country, in the lowland, in the Arabah, in the slopes, in the wilderness, and in the Negev, the land of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And Mount Halak and Machpelah are very close to each other. Machpelah is where Sarah is buried. And we still know that place to this day. Okay, so I don't have an updated, a real close-in map, but here's Jerusalem, and Machpelah, Hebron is right here near Lachish. Machpelah and Halak are right here. Can you see my pointer? Okay. They're right around here. But the Hittites and Hattusha, of the historical Hittites, this is where the digging happened, way up here. So this is some of the difficulty. Is this the same people group? So, okay, let me go back a little bit. So then you have it in Judges. Joseph scouted out Bethel. Now this name of the city was formerly Luz, and the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and called its name Luz. That is its name to this day. So this is Bethel, which is just nearby to Jerusalem, was founded by a Hittite man. Ezra 9:1. So this is after the return. You still have Hittites there. So there was Hittites when it was just Abraham. There was Hittites as Joshua was coming in to take over the land. There were Hittites still there, like we know Uriah the Hittite. So they persisted. They did not wipe them out. Then even when they've been taken over by Babylon, and then they come back, still Hittites here. The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land with their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. So they're still there. 1 Kings 10:29. A chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, a horse for 150. And so the king's traders, Solomon's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. So are they close? Is this almost a hendiadys? Is this almost one thing? The kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. They might be operating in similar spheres there, or are they operating in different geographies? I think they're in a similar sphere. 2 Kings 7:6. For the Lord had made the army of the Syrians hear the sound of the chariots and of horses, the sound of a great army. So they said to one another, behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to come against us. So the Hittites are separate and different from the Syrians or the Aramaeans, but they're operating in the same similar theater. And then finally, Ezekiel 16:3, which we've heard before, and say, thus says the Lord God to Jerusalem, your origin and your birth are of the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite. This is a slight against Israel, saying you're basically of the same quality of people, of the same type of people as the Amorites, who you may remember from our first lecture were a shepherding people, and then the Hittites, which we'll get into in a moment here. And it's still a little bit of a question mark, is who are they? Who should we understand them to be? Okay? So they're listed in these lists. The Hittites were listed in these lists with the Canaanites and other people in that land. Are they Canaanites? Are they a subsection of Canaanites? Were they refugees from a former Hittite kingdom that fled down there after the fall of their kingdom? Were they Israelites? They have Semitic names. So this is something that people who don't believe the Bible think is like, oh, they're just Israelites from a different father, Het. Or were they Neo-Hittites? So what's otherwise called Iron Age Hittites or Syrian Hittites, who were not from way up here near Hattusha, but were from here. All right? So I ask, where were they? Were they in Egypt? Oh, I can't remember why there's even a theory about that. Jerusalem, we saw that Bethel, were they from this area? Anatolia, which is this whole area, is this where we should think of them? Northern Syria, Canaan, down here in the hill country. Where were they? It's a little bit of a question mark because we've got record of them in all those different places. The Hittite history is coextensive with Israel, of course. We have it in our scriptures. The ruin of Egypt thus left the Hittites independent in North Syria about the time when, according to the Old Testament chronology, Palestine was conquered by Joshua. They probably acknowledged Arandas, the successor of Shubililiuma, as their suzerain. Egypt started pulling back from its empire. There was this incursion of the sea peoples that greatly affected the Hittites. And so both the Hittites and the Egyptians were kind of pulling back at the same time as Israel was arising. So that's happening at the same time. This is going into it a little bit more in depth. The Hittite power began, however, to decline in consequence of attacks from the west by hostile Aryan invaders. Egypt is our only record of it. They're calling them the Sea People. They're thinking they're Greeks. In the 5th year of Seti Meremta, son of Ramesses II, these fair peoples of the north raided the Syrian coasts and advanced even to Belbis and Heliopolis in Egypt in alliance with the Libyans west of the Delta. So we covered a little bit of this in our lecture on Egypt. They were defeated, and Meremta appears to have pursued them even to Pan-Canaan near Tyre. A text of his 5th year, found by Flinders Petrie, this is the Meremta stela that we talked about before, speaks of this campaign and says that while Israel is spoiled, the Hittites are quieted. For Meremta appears to have been on good terms with them and allowed corn to be sent in ships to preserve the life of this people of Hatti. It seems they were on the ropes. Deucalion was succeeded by his son, Arnuata, as the great king, of whom a bilingual seal has been found in Hittite and cuneiform characters. But the confederacy of the Hittite tribes, which had so long resisted Egypt, seems to have been broken up by these disasters by the increasing power of Assyria. So they fell. They fell at the end of the Bronze Age when the Sea Peoples came. They were on the ropes. They needed corn supplies. And then half a century later, 1150 BC, the Assyrians began to invade Syria, and Ashur-ishi reached Beirut. For even as early as about 1270, Tukulti-Nipnip of Assyria had conquered the Kassites, which were a Hittite-type tribe, and had set a Semitic prince on their throne in Babylon. Early in his reign, about 1130, Tiglath-Pileser I, who you might know from the Bible, claims to have subdued 42 kings marching to the fords of the Euphrates, the land of the Hatti, and the upper sea of the setting sun, or Mediterranean. Soldiers of the Hatti had seized the cities of Sumasti, but the Assyrian conqueror made his soldiers swim the Euphrates on skin bags, and so attacked Karshemish of the land of the Hittites. The Moskians in Cappadocia were apparently of Hittite race, ruled by 5 kings, and for 50 years they exacted tribute, and they were defeated. Though placing 20,000 men in the field against Tiglath-Pileser, he advanced to Kumani and to Arini, which was apparently the Hittite capital, west of Caesarea in the same region, and he conquered them. Okay, so again, they fell by the Sea Peoples, they fell by the arising Assyrians. It wasn't until 1908 that we had very much good cuneiform record of them. That's why they're kind of treated as the redheaded stepchild of the great Bronze Age kingdoms, because we don't have a whole lot of record of what they were up to. So what was their religion? Well, again, we're in a little bit of a bind because we don't have their mythology texts before us. So a lot of what we have to find out is from later, is from other people talking about it, is from pictures. So even this picture right here, they say this is the 12 gods of the underworld, but I don't know, I wasn't able to look into this as to why they know that these are gods and not just great warriors stuck in the underworld. I don't know. But they have Sutek, great ruler of heaven. He's the lightning god. They have Ishtar, or Ashtoreth, who was represented on a bilingual seal as Iskara, known to the Kassites as, sorry, there's a misspelling, as Ishtar. So there again, you have a connection. So this is not, this is archaeological record. This is not just something the Bible says. that they worshipped Ishtar. And then we saw that they had these pillars and Asherah poles. The Babylonian god Rimmon was known to them, the Hittite, as Tsupas. And again, we don't have much information, but their gods are standing on lions. So that's about, that doesn't tell us much, but at least we have that. This is, I think, this is not Hattushili or Mushili. I think this is Supililuma, a picture of him. But some of their history that we do have is Hattushili the first founded the city of Hattusha and expanded the empire across Asia Minor. Hattushili just means man from Hattusha. His grandson, Mushili, subjugated Yamad, which is kind of like in ancient Syria. So here's Hattusha, here's Yamad, was right in here. Here's Ugarit that we covered before. Yamad was a neighbor of that. Mushili subjugated Yamad and even burned Babylon. So he went really far, but later he had to retreat, and instead of a triumphant welcome, when he came back to Hattusha, he was assassinated. And assassination was something that they repeatedly had to deal with. It was a great weakness of the Hittite Empire. One king, I can't remember his name, but his daughter and wife were killed instead of him. But to try to stop the bloodshed, he had mercy and just exiled the murderers instead of killing them, and tried to put into practice of, guys, not assassinate each other here. It was such a problem. 1259, we have this is in their latter years, but we have the first known written treaty in existence is between the Hittites and the Egyptians, between Hattushili and Ramesses II. So when the pagans, when the secular world thinks of the Hittites, they think of this treaty as peacemakers. Hattushili's grandson was the last known ruler of the Hittite Empire as it fell to climate change. So this is at the end of the Bronze Empire. This is those Aryan invaders coming in, and the hypothesis is that this was because of failing crops in Europe that they had to invade. It's all just hypotheses that they're making, and I guess trying to say climate change is real, and it's going to cause big problems for us too. So they invaded from the Egyptian. They invaded from the Aegean. The Egyptians were able to repel them. The Hittites were not. Shupililiuma II died between 1180 and 1176 to the Kashka burning the city of Hattusha. Again, this is how we have those cuneiform tablets. Clay tablets, there was wood tablets too, of course those are gone, but the clay tablets fired by their destruction is how we're able to have record of them that we found in around 1906, 1908. And then after that, so that's the fall of the main Hittite Empire, the glorious large empire that we have the cuneiform tablets of. But then these Neo-Hittite states persisted in the Syrian area. So what about them? So this is now into the Iron Age. This is now getting into the time coextensive with Israel's invading and staying in the area that we know them for. These guys, the Neo-Hittites, think of the Syria Ahmad region, used the Luwian language and hieroglyphs on their inscriptions. Karshemish was the most successful city, but was absorbed by the Assyrians in 717. We talked about Tiglath-Pileser coming in and taking that over. And despite Asituwadas calling down curses on anyone who would erase his name from his inscribed gates, the Neo-Assyrian nations were removed from power. So they were in power in that Assyrian area, but even Assyria, remember, fell to Babylon. And so, summing all of this up, my hypothesis is that after the fall of the Hittite Empire, a group of people still wanting to be considered Hittite moved into the land of Canaan. Alternatively, these Hittites may have been there long before the fall of the Hittite Empire. Hittite Empire was in play in that area. They were constantly fighting and making treaties with Egypt. They were trying to bump up their influence in that area. It could have been like a colony of the Hittite Empire. But the problem is we just don't have very much record. That's why it's just a hypothesis and not a surety. Okay. Any questions on them or added knowledge? It's kind of fuzzy because we're lacking some details. And I, just for the sake of time, I did skip over a lot of the Hittite history that we know of in Anatolia because it doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of bearing on the biblical world in helping us. And also it doesn't talk very much about their religion. Mostly what we know about that is just from the pictures, from their leftover engravings. All right? So how do they point us to Christ? Despite having the natural resources to thrive in the Bronze Age. So one of the reasons we know about them is because they were trading with Nineveh. They were trading with the Ammonites. They had what was needed up there. And despite huge standing armies capable of taking Babylon, was Israel ever capable of taking Babylon? David, great warrior king. He didn't even think about that. But these guys did it. What was it? Skin sleds over the Euphrates? They were impressive. And they had naval capability. They took the island of Cyprus, again, for natural resources. The Hittites conquered Cyprus at a point. They didn't maintain control over it for too long, but Israel's never boasted of such a thing. But that was what the power that these guys had. They had early walled cities and trades. Some of the earliest archaeological evidences that we have of walled cities anywhere is in the Hittite region. And they had marriage alliances with Egypt. Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
What was the approximate date of the Cyprus was conquered by that?
Either in the 1300s or 1200s BC.
Okay.
It's
13 and 12.
Yeah, it's relatively late in their time, near to their fall. But despite all that, they were a virtually unknown people until archaeological finds of 100 years ago. People didn't question their existence, but we weren't that impressed. Meanwhile, the Hebrews, who had none of these advantages and were not supposed to make entangling alliances or build up giant armies or have a perennial influence, or have large caches of precious metals. They had a perennial influence on history. Why? Through their devotion to the Lord God. Who impresses us more? Who has had more of an effect? They were smaller, they were weaker, they had less natural resources. Doesn't matter. The Lord was their God. So, esteem the rock that is Christ instead of earthly powers. And we know this, but we just need reminder of it every now and then as big powers with lots of resources, lots of alliances threaten, shake their fist. We don't need to worry about them. They too will fall, and what will be left is the people of God who have allied with Him above all other earthly powers. All right? At this point, we're going to watch a video that maybe confuses us even more.
Today's video. On this channel, we've looked at a number of different people groups of the Bible. We've looked at the Philistines, the Moabites, the Canaanites, and many others that you can check out right here. Now, these are groups that we know a fair amount about from archaeology, the Bible, and extra sources. Today, we want to look at a more confusing group of people, the Hittites. Now, why is this a confusing people group? We know a lot about the Hittites. They were a late Bronze Age kingdom that ruled in Anatolia. the late Bronze Age, Hatti was in central Anatolia around the Halys Basin. Now, this is where the people of the late Bronze Age kingdom originated. They did not call themselves Hittites per se. They referred to themselves by the place of their origin, the land of Hatti. But in the Bible, we do see a phrase that can be translated as Hittite. In fact, there are a few terms that are translated as Hittite. One is the phrase B'nai Het, and the feminine Benot Het. This literally means sons or daughters of Het. Related to this is the term Hitti, which is turning the name Het into a gentilic with the addition of the yod at the end. It's a fancy way of saying it takes the place name and turns it into a word meaning something like person from Het. It always appears with the definite article, ha-Hitti, and is used in one of two ways. It either refers to a person's ethnicity, like Uriah the Hittite or Ephron the Hittite, or it refers to the pre-settlement peoples of the land alongside a standardized list of 5 other groups. In Genesis 23, we see both usages, so we see these are more or less equivalent. Other forms like the feminine singular Hittite occur, such as in Ezekiel 16 and 1 Kings 11. We also see the masculine plural, Hittim, as in Joshua 1 and 1 Kings 10, which refers to the land of the Hittites and the king of the Hittites. Nowadays, no scholar links the biblical Hittites with the Bronze Age Hittites of Anatolia. But if the biblical Hittites aren't the Bronze Age Hittites, then who are they? You can't just say that this group doesn't equate to the group everyone knows as the Hittites without giving an alternative, right? Well, there are 2 general perspectives on how to identify the biblical Hittites. One perspective, outlined by Itmar Singer, separates the references into what he calls inland Hittites and outland Hittites. Another, articulated by Billie Jean Collins and revised by Trevor Bryce, links all the biblical references to the Iron Age Syrian successor states of the Hittites. We'll look at both of these options now.
Singer's term to identify the biblical references to sons and daughters of Het is inland Hittites. These are Hittites that appear in the Torah, in the stories of the patriarchs, and in the standardized lists of peoples allotted for extermination when the Israelites take the Promised Land. Genesis 23, when Abraham's wife Sarah dies at Hebron in the hill country of southern Palestine, Abraham goes to the Hittites to buy a plot of land to bury her. He purchases a cave from someone named Ephron, son of Zohar, also identified as Ephron the Hittite. Here we see both the sons of Het used as well as the gentilic Hitti, yet we also see it applied to Ephron, a man with a Semitic name. In places like Deuteronomy 20, we see the Hittites mentioned alongside the Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. These are the pre-Israelite occupants of the Promised Land, the people God commanded Israel to subdue when they entered into the land. The Jebusites are linked with Jerusalem and its immediate area. Canaanites seems to apply to the people on the coastal plain and the valleys, like the Jezreel Valley, although it's also used as a more general term for all the people in the region. We also see in Genesis 10 in the Table of Nations that Canaan was the father of Het and a number of these other tribal elements of the land. Amorites typically applies to people in the highlands of Canaan, and we see the Hittites also seem to be associated with the Judean highlands in the area around Hebron. The implication here is that these Hittites, or the sons of Het, are not directly related to the Bronze Age Indo-European inhabitants of Hatti. Rather, they are a tribe or clan of local indigenous Canaanite origin. They were called the sons of Het, which we translate Hittite, and were a dominant tribal element in the Judean highlands prior to the settlement of the land by the Israelites. These were the people in the patriarchal narratives and the ones allotted for extermination. They are local Canaanites. Now, this is one perspective, but there's another perspective that's also worth exploring. Singer argues that there are a number of references to Hittites that do not apply to these so-called inland Hittites. References in Joshua, Judges, and in 1st and 2nd Kings all seem to be referencing people outside of southern Palestine. These refer to what Singer calls outland Hittites, which he identifies as the Syro-Hittite successor states in northern Syria. These states are sometimes called Neo-Hittite, but the Bronze Age Kingdom is also called the Neo-Hittite Kingdom, so to avoid that confusion, we'll call them Syro-Hittite. Just know that you can see both terms used in the academic literature, as if this wasn't confusing enough already. So what were these Syro-Hittite states? With the collapse of the Anatolian kingdom of Hatti at the end of the Bronze Age, multiple smaller successor states appeared in northern Syria and in Cilicia. These states were smaller kingdoms that modeled themselves after the Bronze Age Hittite Empire. They existed in what had been the Syrian portions of the Hittite kingdom. Excavations have shown that there is cultural continuity in several of these kingdoms with the Bronze Age Empire. We even see Iron Age Assyrian texts refer to this land as Hatti, the same term used to describe the Halys Basin in the Bronze Age, indicating these places were understood as the successor of the Bronze Age Hittites. Some of these Syro-Hittite kingdoms had kings who could trace their lineage back to the Hittite royal family. They used Luwian, the language used in Hittite monumental inscriptions, in their own monumental inscriptions. These kings often had or took on Luwian names. Their art reflects continuity with the Hittite tradition, particularly when reflecting religious and royal ideology. Cremation and burials, which were completely absent in Syria in the Bronze Age but were popular in Anatolia, became common in Syria in the Iron Age. Several structures, like the Temple Ain Dara, indicate continuity across the Bronze Age Iron Age transition. So these Syro-Hittite kingdoms were the successors of the Hittites, but it's not clear to what extent they were populated by the Indo-European peoples that formed the core of the Bronze Age Hittite population, as opposed to local populations emulating Hittite traditions. Because there's a lot of evidence that points to these kingdoms being quite diverse. The monumental inscriptions, the ones that were in Luwian, were often bilingual or even trilingual inscriptions with Aramaic or Phoenician, indicating that they were intended to be read by people with diverse linguistic backgrounds. The people of these kingdoms were at least partially, if not mostly, Arameans or local Phoenicians, even if their royal ideology and perhaps elite families were sometimes the heirs of the Bronze Age Hittites. It's possible these kingdoms were populated with refugees from the Hittite collapse of the Bronze Age, but they also had sizable Aramean and Phoenician populations. These kingdoms then were evolutions which incorporated Bronze Age Hittite traditions with Bronze Age Syrian traditions to make a distinct Syro-Hittite Iron Age tradition, where identification strategies and their relationship with power evolved over time. These kingdoms are the ones which seem to be behind several of the later biblical references to the Hittites. Solomon married a Hittite woman, and the description of the temple in 1 Kings 6 has a close parallel to a contemporary temple at Tel Tayana, a capital of one of the Syro-Hittite states. This led many scholars to suggest, given how Solomon frequently drew on northern influences, that the Tayanat temple may have served as a kind of prototype for Solomon's temple design. We also see Solomon is said to have sold chariots to the kings of the Hittites in 1 Kings 10. This passage emphasizes his role as a middleman between Egypt and Syria as being the source of his fantastic wealth. It says he purchased horses in Kue, a Syro-Hittite kingdom in Cilicia, and Egypt, and sold them to the kings of the Arameans and Hittites, two cultural elements which dominated the Syro-Hittite kingdoms of northern Syria. In 2 Kings 7, the invading king of Aram in Damascus flees his siege of Samaria, fearing the kings of Israel had hired the kings of Egypt and of the Hittites to attack. And these all seem to be clear references to Syrian kingdoms. The question remains whether the other references, the so-called inland Hittites, may also be references to these Syro-Hittite kingdoms. Billie Jean Collins and Trevor Bryce have suggested that these inland Hittites may be related to either the Bronze Age Hittites or the Syro-Hittites. They've been refugees or immigrants from Bronze Age Hittite-controlled territory of Syria. They may not have been ethnically Hittite, but come from the land formerly controlled by the Hittites, which in the Iron Age would have been from the Syro-Hittite polities or the land of Hatti. As with Singer's model of the inland Hittites being essentially a tribe of Canaanites, this perspective explains why several Hittite people in the Old Testament have Semitic names, something we should not expect for Bronze Age Hittites. Ahimelech and Uriah, both soldiers who fought with David, have Semitic names. They may have been Syrian refugees, or they may have been Israelites with partial Syrian heritage.
I think today's topic is a fascinating study in how reading the historical accounts of the Bible isn't always as straightforward as it seems. There's a ton of knowledge that was assumed for the original readers, but that we have to work to understand today. And even then, we may be left with more questions than answers. As we've seen from this series on people groups of the Bible, the people who inhabited the lands around ancient Israel came from diverse origins. They exhibited varied social and political structures, and they related to Israel in different ways. Understanding the differences between these groups takes digging into the biblical text, as well as exploring the evidence we have beyond the text. In the case of the Hittites, we see several biblical terms that are all translated Hittite, but that are used in different parts of the Bible and may refer to distinct people groups. The biblical Hittites may be the people of the Syro-Hittite successor kingdoms of the Iron Age, located in Cilicia and northern Syria. They may also refer to a Canaanite clan that was named after an eponymous ancestor, Het. Whether this ancestor was originally from Hittite-controlled Syria is a matter of ongoing debate. The Hittites are perhaps notable for having no ongoing conflict with the Israelites into the period of the monarchy, following their initial conquest by the Israelite settlement group, unlike some other groups that we've talked about. Now, perhaps this is because the tribe or clan which inhabited the Judean highlands was wiped out, and later references to Hittites denote the Syro-Hittite kingdom, which was not part of this earlier conflict. They were trading partners and occasional allies with Israel, and both kingdoms seem to have coexisted peacefully. The identification of two of David's soldiers as Hittites suggests that the remnants of the earlier clan may have been assimilated into Israelite life, to such a degree that their descendants were given Semitic names. So the next time you read about the Hittites in the Bible, take a minute to pause and consider the context, because they're not all the same. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video.
Say where that leaves them in your understanding of the Hittites of the Bible. The metaphor that I would put before you, and I'm just making this up, is like the term Latin. Okay, if someone says, I'm Latin, or she's Latino, does that mean that this person is from Rome? No. This person can have very little to do. Does that mean that this person even speaks Latin? Not necessarily. They might speak a Latinized language, a Romantic language, but it's in their heritage. They've been influenced by them, and so that's why I think you have characters like Uriah and Ahimelech, which means my brother the king, serving there. Why do they want to be known as Hittites even? I think they're describing their heritage. I think you can also think of them as almost colonials. Remember, Israel was in play between all these different major kingdoms. They were on the road basically between Asia, between Arabia, Africa, and Europe. And so different people groups were trying to take it over. And so you may have had some basically Hittite colonials there at the end of the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. And that's why they have property. That's why Abraham interacts with them. All right. Any more comments or questions? Well, yeah, go ahead, Graham.
So you mentioned it was Aryan invaders.
Aryan invaders, yeah.
So are those similar to the ones that Hitler makes mention of in Mein Kampf?
Mein Kampf, yeah. They're European. The only record that we have is from the Egyptians describing them. And we talked about that, I think, in the Egyptian lecture. We think that they're from maybe Sardinia and some other European areas and Greek areas. I think some of it is known, some of it's unknown. But yeah, European. Yeah, Josh?
So is Abraham at the end of you said the late Bronze Age?
I think Abraham's into the Iron Age.
He's into the
Well,
Iron Age.
No. You're right. He's bronze. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, and then so how long did that age last? Or we have no idea.
That's a good question. You can look into it for your homework, and I will too. I don't remember.